Honor to be here. I am so happy to share with you a little bit about my recent research. As Dr. Shebna was explaining, I have been a faculty member at Georgetown University since 2011, and I am right now associated with Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security Institute. And if you cannot hear, just raise your hands and let me know. But what I wanted to share with you today, I'm going to first share my screen. And let me know if you can see my screen. Do you see the? Okay. So today I'll be talking to you about the US immigration policy and gender, especially from Afghan women's experience. I have been working on Afghan women's issues for the last 2 or so years. So this is an area that I have been spending a lot of time with. But before I wanted to do that, I also wanted to give you a little bit context of how the current status of forced displacement is, and what is the relationship between gender and displacement, and a little bit of the UNHCR's guidelines and framework on gender before I look at the immigration in the US and Biden administration's refugee policies. I will also talk a little bit about the Afghan crisis since last August, and what are we doing at Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security with our Afghan initiative. So as many of you might know, today, these are statistics from December 2020, a year ago. The number of forcibly displaced people in the world were over 80 million people. And this number is expected to be much higher this year with the Afghan crisis and other crises that's been going on. So out of this 82.4 million forcefully displaced people, only 26.4 million are refugees. And out of these refugees, only 20.7 million refugees are under the UNHCR's mandate. And this is a really concerning number because we'll see that the global displacement statistics have been changing rapidly, and the number of displaced people have increased over the last 10 years dramatically. So we have never in the world history experienced such an enormous number of challenges when it comes to displacement. And today, only about 285,000 refugees were returned back to their homes and resettled. So a lot of these refugees are not being able to go back to their homes. This creates a lot of crisis on different levels. For example, it creates humanitarian crisis, it develops a development crisis because of the pressure it puts on communities. It creates a security crisis, but not only security in terms of national security, but also human security defined in terms of food security, health security, environmental security, social capital and social security, all these different aspects. I think it's also important to remember the definitions of all these people who are forcibly displaced. The refugee really refers to those individuals who cross borders between their country to another country, especially because their lives and freedom are threatened, and they are protected under the UN Convention. And this means they have certain rights under the UN Convention, and states who are parties to the convention are obligated to protect these individuals. So this allows them to get access to humanitarian food, humanitarian emergency resources such as food, shelter, healthcare, and education. But not everyone is really able to have access to these resources. For example, internally displaced people are those individuals who had to leave their homes, but they were not able to cross their borders, and they remain there in their own communities and their countries. But what happens is that they are not covered by the Refugee Convention legally, and they're under the protection of the states that the countries they're living in. And in many cases, the country's conditions, the states are the problem, the causes of these displacements. So they're really in a very difficult situation. For example, right now, more people are internally displaced in Afghanistan than those who are able to come out. So also another, you already probably know this, the countries that host the most refugees are usually from what we call the global south, with Turkey as having the highest number of refugees, with more than 3.5 million people. This statistics were a year ago. So now with the influx of Afghan refugees, these numbers probably have increased dramatically as well. It is followed by Colombia, Pakistan. Among the wealthier global north countries, only Germany is a country that has been hosting more refugees, relatively speaking. They would be the number 5. And 68% of refugees come from 5 countries. These are also, again, from statistics before the Afghan crisis, with the largest number of refugees are from Syria, followed by Afghanistan, Sudan, Myanmar, Somalia. We also have Venezuela. So but also it is important to recognize that war and violence is not the only source of displacement. We're now finding more and more people are becoming displaced as a result of natural disasters. So this is a statistics to show you that out of this was just in 2018, out of 28 million new displacements, just about less than half of it were from conflict-related displacements, around 10.8 million. Majority were from displacements related to disasters, mostly weather-related. So the changing climate and other challenges have increased the pressure on our societies in that phase. So one of the things that we are really finding in our field, I come from a conflict resolution, peace building field, is that gender is a very important and integral aspect of all different dynamics within conflicts, as well as in the forced displacement. So these are also statistics from 2018. If you look at the number of internally displaced people, you will see that almost more than half of them are women and girls. And many of these women and girls, for example, from a study looking at the Syrian refugees, found that many women, about 73% of them, were suffering post-traumatic stress disorder, and the numbers were higher among women than men. So the 55% of women living in the refugee camps have sufficient access to menstrual hygiene or healthcare products that are important for women's health and hygiene. The gender-based violence, including sexual violence, increases during times of displacement, and statistics show that 1 in every 5 internally displaced or refugee women living in a humanitarian crisis and armed conflict have experienced a form of sexual violence. Also, 7 of the 10 highest refugee housing countries restricts women's participation in certain industries. So this means that women's access to economic opportunities and livelihoods is much more restricted, which makes them more at risk for becoming poor. So this means that women and girls are particularly vulnerable to different kinds of experience, like conflict. Women and men experience these displacements very differently. And so the changes are too sudden. So we have been working with a lot of Afghan women on the ground before the crisis. And many of them who were able to leave are completely traumatized right now, and they need some time and some ways to sort of process what has been happening. Some people had to leave some family members, etc. So it is really how do you and the way women and men deal with these traumatic experiences are very different. Also, the way our societies inform our gender roles and our really inform our experiences, our gendered experiences in conflict. For example, in the case of Afghan women, one way that the US policy, which I'll talk a bit more later on, impacted women and men differently was that United States first came out with a refugee immigration status called special immigrant visas. These immigrant visas were for those people who had been working with Americans, and Americans were usually working with men because of the context, because they needed translators, because they were engaged with the military and other community members. They were mostly men who qualified for this special immigrant visa. Many women were working on human rights issues, women's rights issues, educators, doctors. They did not have the same connection. So when you look, many of these women who were sort of empowered from a Western point of view were left behind with these special visas. This was true for many European countries as well. They also prioritize people that work with them and their governments. So this left a lot of women behind. Among the women who were able to come out, many women did not want to leave their family members, did not want to leave their parents or sisters and brothers. And so especially in times of conflict, women's roles as caregiving or caregivers create special urgency and special need in their communities, and women are less likely to leave family members behind. So women and girls are less mobile in that sense. But this is also informed by another reason. In many societies like Afghanistan, women and girls have less access to economic resources, have less papers or passports. Therefore, they do not have the financial resources to leave their countries or even get on a plane. So they're much more dependent. And they don't have the papers, etc. So also when women were trying to leave their homes, there were more restrictions of women's mobility in Afghanistan. So it was much, much harder for women to leave, especially if refugees have to go through very difficult road trips like the ones from Afghanistan to Turkey, where you have to cross really difficult mountains. Women's risk of becoming trafficked increases, and women become much more targets. They have less survival rate, and so it's much less number of women who can do this kind of trips than men. So they're sometimes asked why there are more men coming than women. These are some of the reasons why it makes it much more difficult for women to leave their communities. So what other thing is that I think women are considered to be the sort of in countries like Afghanistan, the holders of culture and holders of honor. That is also not necessarily a positive thing, but that is usually the role they've been playing. So it becomes really difficult for women to flee. And also when they're fleeing, the way the international structures may also operate, like usually UNHCR records people with the head of household, which may be usually men, etc. So this creates a lot of difficulties for women to have access to certain resources as well. And there are other difficulties that women face, but there are also opportunities. For example, once refugees, it is harder for men to be profiled and far harder for men to find jobs than women. Women tend to be more flexible in terms of what they will be they're not seen as a threat as men. Therefore, communities are much more open to helping and supporting or hiring women. But women can be more invisible, and so their needs may not be recognized or addressed. Women don't necessarily go and raise their voices, especially coming from cultures that are much more sort of giving the roles to talk in public to men. So this means that we don't always understand the needs of men, the needs of women and girls. So based on these findings and realizations, international system is trying to gender mainstream humanitarian action, which means that we have to first have a good understanding how in each case gender is impacting different people. This also in the US, we've focused also on not only women and girls, which is also focusing on different age categories, but also LGBTQ communities. So based on that, we sort of have to conduct a gender analysis to understand what are some of the gender roles in that group of refugees, and then think about ways to address the woman's needs, because when the gender analysis also is used to identify specific needs, both of men and women, and based on those needs, how do we sort of satisfy those needs? How do we address those needs? But in addition to that, how can we empower women? This is also supported by other programs that aims to prevent gender-based violence, as well as, responding to them, providing healthcare services that are gendered. and that also includes mental health. So then how do we even sort of think about ways to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse? For example, how do you put the tents in a place? Where do you put the light posts can really influence, or the water. A lot of women become targets for sexual exploitation and abuse because water sources are put far away, and women are the main women are, for example, in many times the people who are supposed to go and get the water. Having water resources far away makes it much more risky for them. Or sometimes where you put the schools make it very difficult for girls to go to school as well. So, but in addition to addressing the gendered needs of refugees, the decision-making process at the organizational level must also be gender balanced. So this means the agencies, the staff must have a balanced gender dynamic. Also, we have to contextualize our sort of interventions and help in a way that is meaningful, culturally appropriate for these communities. So there are different, the UNHCR provides a number of different guidelines. I'm not going to go into them too much right now, but if you have any questions, I'll be happy to sort of address. But there were a couple of important frameworks that were developed, especially in 2012. The guidelines on international protection on gender-related prosecution was recognized. In 2018, they adopted age, gender, and diversity policy, which recognizes that men and women cannot be essentialized or categorized as simple binary categories. There are differences among men and women. These differences are influenced by their age. For example, young girls are have different experiences and impacted by these displacement differently than older women, etc. So we have to have this idea of intersectionality, how different intersecting identities influence our experiences and create unique vulnerabilities. And in 2020, the UNHCR developed this policy on prevention of risk mitigation and response to gender-based violence. So here are different accommodations. I shared these slides with the organizing team, so they may be able to share it with you, but some of these sort of gender mainstream perspective really requires us to look at different aspects of response. For example, reception and accommodation conditions are one element. How do we address these issues from a gendered perspective? How do we sort of gender sensitivize asylum processes? How do we recognize the needs of different groups, especially most vulnerable groups? How do we provide access to services and education of men, women, girls, boys, LGBTQ communities? So we have to, like when we are developing healthcare mechanisms, we have to think about women's and girls' needs separately than men's needs. Even with economic opportunities. For example, providing economic opportunities for women need affordable childcare, etc. So all of this, when countries are reintegrating or integrating, resettling refugees, they have to take into consideration. Another important element is that how can we provide meaningful participation and leadership opportunities? And a new, shouldn't be that new, but another important aspect of it is that how do we protect and respect the dignity of refugees? It just doesn't become just an identity marker there, but we see them as their full humanity. And so these are very important. So moving on to the immigration within the context of United States. If you think United States considers itself one of the most welcoming immigrant countries out there, although some people may disagree on this, but there has been a number of different approaches throughout the since its establishment as a state about immigration policies in the United States. This is a graph from a Migration Policy Institute that shows the immigration trends within the United States, starting from 1700s to 2015 or so. And as I said, from its inception, United States have considered itself to be a country of immigrants, and it is a country that attracts the largest number of immigrants in the world. And these immigrants tend to become part of the fabric of the United States society. So there are different avenues for citizenship, becoming legal permanent, residents in the United States, as well as, immigration policies. So there, but the immigration has not always been so smooth in the United States. The first time there was a law that sort of organized and arranged a US immigration policy was in 1790s. This was a very restrictive policy that was focused only on white West European people of what was called the good moral character, and they had to be living in the US for at least 2 years. So in 1870s, the citizenship was extended to those who were not of African origin. There were also other changes that happened, how long the person had to be in the United States before they could be considered for application. So in 1900s, the immigration flow shifted from North and Western Europe to the Southern and Eastern European. There was more openness to have immigrants from different parts of Europe at the time. But there were some restrictions on certain ethnic communities, like the Chinese. For example, in 1943, for example, the US limited the number of Chinese that could immigrate to the United States. And US was not initially a party to the Convention on Refugees, but they became a party later on when they signed the protocol. But the US also had some issues with letting in refugees during the Second World War as well. And in 1952, US developed its National Immigration and Nationality Act. This act in 1952 continued the restriction on Chinese and extended to other Asians, and other races were also limiting. But in 1952, these limitations were moved away from, and then in 1965, there was a whole new system getting rid of all these ethnic limitations, but favoring a family reunification and skilled immigrants rather than these quotas on different ethnic communities. In the 80s, there were other immigration reform, and so who could come in? There was mainly people who are coming into the US was from Latin America, who would meet certain conditions, and there was also a focus on qualified immigrants to come to the United States. But the immigration policies changed dramatically after 9/11 because the focus has become on national security. And in this period, the Department of Homeland Security was developed, and which was really a major change, which I'll mention a bit more later on. During the Obama, there was an executive action allowing young adults who have been brought illegally to apply for deportation relief. This is called the DACA, and this was later on expanded to other people. But during the Trump administration, the immigration was cut down almost 51%, around 49%, and refugee asylum seekers were cut down more than almost 90%. It was down to, I think during the highest period, there were 110,000 refugees would be allowed a year. That was their ceiling, but this number was reduced to 30,000 under Trump administration. And Trump, especially after COVID, these numbers became even smaller. So this is it can show you the changes of number of refugees that were admitted to the United States, starting from 1970s. Jimmy Carter's years were some of the highest, but then we see a dramatic decrease during the 80s. There was a little bit high on the times of Clinton administration, but then it goes up and down with Trump administration having the lowest numbers. So after 9/11, the Homeland Security Department was created, which had 3 different components. So there was the US Customs and Border Protection. There is the Immigration, Customs and Enforcement. It's called ICE, and you can see like some of the controversies around this was in the south border of the United States. ICE has this responsibility to identify people and send them back. And then there's the Citizenship and Immigration Services. And so today, US immigration faces a number of different challenges. The southern border has been a major crisis. The Afghan refugee influx has been a major crisis. Biden tries to turn all of these reverse, and I will talk about Biden in a second, but the COVID-19 pandemic really impacted the immigration issues as well. So US refugee admissions program is under the Immigration and Nationality Act of 52. So this is how the US defines a refugee. A refugee is an alien who generally has experienced past persecution or has a well-founded fear of persecution on account of his race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or a public opinion. There was also, I think Trump might have changed this, but a gender-based persecution. So women who are experiencing gender-based violence in their communities, femicides from Latin America in particular, were eligible for a refugee status. So since the passage of the Refugee Act in 1980, there has been around 3.1 million refugees admitted to the United States. So Biden administration, one of the promises of Biden administration, it was to reverse some of the policies of Trump administration when it comes to the refugees, but also immigration policies in general. One of the major critiques of Biden administration, especially before the Afghan crisis, was that they have been very, very slow in acting on these. So Biden's administration increased the cap of people who could come to the United States as refugees to 62,000 for the year 2021. So according to US law, each year the administration will give a proposal to the Congress setting up some of the expectations, how much the ceiling they will have for their refugee policy. So Biden administration prepared their policy, but some of these policies had to be changed. So some of the different priorities of Biden administration is that first they have priority one, individuals, refugees. These are people who are referred to the US by the UNHCR, and they're inside the countries of origin. They focus mostly on 3 countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Priority 2 countries are countries, those people who are persecuted as religious minorities in certain countries like Iran, Eurasia, Baltics, Iraqi groups who served and helped the US, people from Cuba. So there's very specific categories with specific types of people. And so the other populations that they included, Biden's administration included, were the Turkic Muslim, refugees of China, refugees, activists, journalists from, let's just say Hong Kong, not Hong Kong, but Rohingya Muslims from Burma, LGBTQI people, and religious minorities from Iraq. So Afghan nationals fall into the P2 designation, and they were originally thought of those with special immigrant visas, as I said, were focused on those individuals who worked with the US as contractors, etc. And then there were others who were sort of employed in Afghanistan by US-based media organization, etc. But a lot of these people happen to be men rather than women. So here are the sort of different ways, the different caps for the next year. And also you can see projected.
Can I ask a question very quick regarding the last slide?
Of course.
Yes, the P2 designation where Afghan nationals fall under, right?
Yes.
And you said here the minimum time in service for this SIVs. What is the minimum time required to apply for the SIV visa?
When this came out, I think they changed it. I think they should be at least 6 months, but I am not 100% sure. I can find that information.
Thank you. Yes, because I know many people applied for it. Some are waiting in different transit countries, right? Start Albania, etc. You know, even Pakistan, I think. Maybe Turkey, we are not sure. Nobody's.
Turkey is not from. They're not with the. They don't have that relation with the U.S. right now. But Pakistan, UAE.
Yes, UAE, Pakistan, but Albania also.
Yes.
In the yeah. Okay, great. So 6 months minimum.
I think, but I am not sure. I will check that for you.
Okay, dear. Thank you.
Don't quote me on that yet. But I think, so I did this. I don't think they had that listed on their policy. I would have put it there, but I think that's the idea. The reason I said 6 months is because of the people that I know. They're at least 6 months. They had 6 months back, but I don't know if it's shorter now or like longer. So these are some of the different sort of quotas that they have. There's also this, as you could see, for example, the US expects to sort of allocate the ceiling for around 40,000 for Africa. So they have all these different subcategories, and they have an unallocated reserve for emergency situations. So how does it work? So as you said, so for there are many different ways in which US has been trying to accept refugees. One of it is the third countries like Albania or Turkey or Iran or Pakistan. I mean, Iran does not work with the US either, but so people who are in a third country can access the process. Or for the emergency situation in Afghanistan, they had created some opportunities for people to come directly to US as well. So usually how the system works, there are certain different elements of it. First, there are overseas processing services. These are sort of recognized NGOs that are sometimes funded by the US. They support the Resettlement Support Center to assist with the processing. So they help with helping people while they're in these like kind of shelters or centers, they call it. So they also, in these places, they also provide a cultural orientation, usually how to prepare the life changes, give us a little bit of an understanding of how life will be in the US, not only US cultural context, but also different sort of structures of the US that people need to adjust. Then they will provide transportation. So funds international transportation through the program administrated by, so they work with international immigration organization, International Organization of Migration, sorry. And so they will work with them on this issue. Then there's the reception and placement. So they have cooperative agreements with 9 nonprofits that I will share with you. And then these nonprofit organizations. So what the US does is that they sort of allocate, they have a system to allocate you to one of these organizations, and those organizations will then work with you to relocate you to a different place. So this then they have these initial core services of providing housing, furnishing. So for example, and this is all done through what's called the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is purpose is to help refugees transition to the United States. So I have a little image there to show you how this system works within the US. So they work with a lot of different aspects of it, from employment training to English training to cash assistance to job placement. There are, for example, organizations that will help immigrants, qualified immigrants, to find jobs who can actually be placed. Because one of the biggest challenges is that you may have had a degree in a field, let's say computer science, but when you come to the United States, it is very difficult to find a job in your own area. So these organizations, what they do is they work with you to write your resumes, your your sort of letters, help you with your English. They have tests for your English proficiency. Actually, my brother, who got a green card with his family, was lucky to use one of these services, and I can tell that it works because he actually did find a job in his own area, which is a civil engineering area, which he would have not found otherwise. So some of the organizations are usually like civil society organizations, like many of them are religious organizations. So we have a Rotary Club where I'm a member in our area. So we have a refugee program, and we work, for example, with Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. So Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services identifies a family, and they rent an apartment. So our Rotary Club works with them to decorate their house, from their computers to their salt and pepper and the cooked first day meal in their fridge, to their beds, to their kids, things. So we provide a home for them. And then when a refugee comes, they come to a place that feels a little bit like home. So there are different organizations do different things. So there's a really interesting and good to some extent, collaboration between these US government agencies, these NGOs, and the grassroots groups like that. So, but one of the things that, having worked with Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, we are very sensitive to gender mainstreaming. And I will tell you a little bit more what we have been doing with our work to help Afghan women refugees. But we have one new thing that you can see, that the refugee policy of the Biden administration does not have a mention of gender or woman. They have LGBTQ issues identified, but there's no gender mainstreaming. But Biden administration came into power with this idea of we're going to make gender an important component. So they have established a Gender Policy Council. And so they have just recently in October established their first national strategy for gender equality. So we work with a lot of the people in that department, and there's a lot of things that needs to be done. But one thing that we have seen a need is that there's no gender mainstreaming, no understanding of different needs and requirements of gendered needs of the immigrants. So when you look at the immigration and women and girls in the United States, there are some studies that looked at the different needs. So you can see that there are women and girls from all backgrounds. And the number of the immigrant women or the women born outside of US are slightly older overall than the US born women and immigrant men. And they're also more likely to be married, more likely to give birth. They're more likely to lack education, although immigrants usually, once the first generation, are the most educated segment of American society. They usually have much limited access to or language skills. They're more likely to be poor or be at the risk of being poor. Therefore, because of their language skills, etc., they're unemployed, which then leads to their poverty level as well. But there's tendency to be much more insured than non-immigrant women. So the US was, to our surprise, they were surprised that the crisis happened and Taliban took over. And the reason I said that, because we've been working with a lot of Afghan women over the last 2 years through our institute, and we knew that Taliban was coming, and there was a lot of warning from the women's groups. But as usual, women's voices were sidelined. So, but when this all happened, there was a lot of crisis related to women. And when they saw all the people who qualify for special immigrant visas and women were being left behind, it was the civil society, media outlets that start talking about save Afghan women, this and that. It was a little patronizing initially, but I think it really was sort of a momentum that was created for like our organization work with other NGOs and pressured the government to create this parole that was extended to people who were not sort of qualifying for special immigrant visas. So there's now this humanitarian emergency parole, which you can have people who are who have not worked with the US to be on this list, to be evacuated because of their high risk. So there are a lot of women and girls we were able to evacuate. In fact, with DRIPS, we had a fundraiser, which we raised a lot of quite a significant funds. We actually were able to sort of charter planes and evacuate women. And we had women who were placed in the US, we had women placed in centers in Albania, but one of the things that a lot of us focused on was the women's groups. So, so the other new thing that American government is doing is creating this new program that you could sponsor a refugee. So it's giving opportunity for special individuals to actually fund the process of an individual Afghan family. So a person costs around 15,000, and a family of 4 to 5 ranges from 50,000 to 60,000 a year to sponsor, which includes their air flights, housing, helping them find jobs, and other healthcare costs that could be really. One of the interesting things, I think, is that although immigration policy is a very conflicted and very divisive policy in the United States, there has been much more support for Afghan refugees by both parties in the context of the United States. Although the Democrats are much more likely to be open to refugees, but even Republicans consider helping Afghan refugees is a responsibility of the US, especially if they work with the US government before. So, for example, according to a study by Forbes, there's the one on the images from the left are from Vox, and the data from the right is from Forbes. So around this, you can see there's like the number of support is slightly different, but it's still well above 50% in both cases. So according to Forbes, 81% of Americans think US should help Afghans. Only 19% think that should not help. Compared to other immigration issues, that's really quite high. So the support for this is 90% among Democrats, but even independents and Trump voters, the support is 79%, and Republicans, which includes some Trump voters, but it's also broader than that, 76%. And almost 60% of the US population, according to Forbes, thinks US is not doing enough to help Afghan refugees. So, so that's, I guess, one good news coming out. There's a much more support, and I know so many different individuals from all backgrounds really mobilized financially to in other ways. For example, there are companies that are popping up to help refugees. There's a food delivery company that works with refugees, refugee women in particular, where sort of they help refugee women sell their food and deliver them to communities. It's called Foodini, for example. And so there's so many different ways in which the American population at the grassroots level is working to address these issues. And so JUIPS, where I work, because of our history with Afghan women, we started doing a number of different things. One of them was, we're part of a collective effort to aid Afghan women activists, journalists, politicians, civil society leaders, especially those that did not have connections. So this means we do advocacy work. I mean, we work we reach out to from White House to State Department. Our leader, Ambassador Melan Verveer, she was the first global ambassador of women's affairs issues at large in the United States. So she comes from a place where she knows the bureaucracy, she knows and understands the American political system when it comes to issues like this. So we sort of launched an urgent effort to raise funds, as I said, to help the high-risk women in August. And so we sort of called for the humanitarian parole to get there with the 46 other senators so that the women at risk, the leaders and their families will be able to be transported. So we work to identify who are some of the most at-risk women. So we try to be very cautious so that we wanted to have diversity in terms of, so usually one of the things that happens is those who are much more in the urban parts, who are much more connected to the world outside, who have financial or networks, tend to be the ones that who are able to come out. But we wanted to expand to Hazaras and other communities within Afghanistan that may not have these opportunities. So we tried to get a list of priority. Unfortunately, so we, as I said, chartered planes and evacuated them. We work with the State Department, DOD, Defense, the US military to help them get out securely. The other thing that we did was we work with Vital Voices to raise funds. Some of these funds will go to helping them in the process, like from transportation costs to housing, the hotels, the survival needs, from medical care to medicine to clothing. I mean, many people did not have any suitcase, so they need everything as the winter is coming. So we also are trying to sort of push for a more gender mainstream approach. For example, a group of our team members went to Albania to check on what were kinds of things that were the living conditions. So how do we provide gender sensitive emotional trauma support? How do we sort of understand the needs? For example, the other thing that we did in terms of economic stability, we're working with universities around the United States to create something called, there's a system called Scholars at Risk. What it does is this organization works with universities to hire scholars at risk, and they provide them with funds for them to contribute to do research in these communities. So Georgetown will be hosting 2 scholars at risk, one in Washington, D.C., one in Qatar office. We also are sort of helping them find financial avenues, job opportunities. So we're putting them in touch with organizations, etc. And then we're sort of helping them resettle in terms of understanding the healthcare system, etc. So these are some of the things that we've been doing, and there's so much more to do. And I put the link. You could see our website. It's by Googling Georgetown Institute Women, Peace and Security, but there we also have a protectafghanwomen.org. So you could see our projects. It's not a project, it's a sort of fundraiser, our efforts there. So I will end there. I know I talked a bit too much, but if you have any questions, I will stop sharing and